This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April the 24th, the Institute hosted the fourth in its series of annual conferences on themes in defense and security studies. This year's conference focused on global challenges to Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic.
So we really, when we started to look at this conference some months ago, trying to figure out who would be the best person to come and get us started on this subject, the first person that came to our mind was Mr. Rae, Mr. Bob Rae, and we were very grateful that he was able to accept our invitation. So with that, I would like to ask him to step forward and share some of his thoughts on this important subject. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here this morning, and I can honestly say that I know for a fact that I'm speaking to an audience, many of whom know way, way more about this topic than I do, which is a somewhat daunting feeling, but having spent a life in politics, I'm used to this situation. So you'll just have to bear with me. I hope that even the experts among you will find it perhaps helpful, useful to try and organize a little bit one's thoughts in terms of how we talk these issues through. But I wanted to really focus my comments on one question, and that is, what is changing? And the thing that strikes me when I read and study and listen and travel about the Arctic is that it is in a state of dramatic change. It was Marshall McLuhan used to say that we go through life looking at it through a rear view mirror. And I've always thought that was a very good way to think, because in fact a lot of the pictures in our heads about the Arctic have nothing to do with the way it actually is now, and also how it is evolving and changing in terms of its population, in terms of the climate, in terms of the economy, in terms of the future of conditions in the Arctic, but also the future strategic implications of where we are today and where we will be in the years going ahead. So that's my first point. The second is, and I've stolen without her agreement, but so far she hasn't left the room. I asked Eric if he had a map, because I just wanted to be, I don't do PowerPoint well, as my students have discovered at the University of Toronto. But I like occasionally to have a map or a picture so that people can sort of look at and have a sense. And I think what's important about the map is twofold. One is we're looking at the Arctic from the top. And it's very important to do that. It's very important to get the picture out of your heads that says the Arctic is an extension of Canada. It's just an extension of Canada. And this vast, like, we look up north, we see it's ours, we know it's ours, we love it, we don't really want to go there, but we know it's there. And we know it's enormous and it's immense, and it's cold and it's snowy, and it belongs to us, it's ours. So, for example, there's a great foo-for-ah when the North Pole keeps moving, because the North Pole is sort of a concept. And because of the various magnetic pulls and the movement of the planets and the moon and so on, where the North Pole is moves around. And now, of course, the Russians are insisting that the North Pole is in Russia, which I'm sure comes as news to Santa, who had no idea that he was going to have to be learning Russian at the age of 975 years old. The reason that the map is important is for another one, and that's what I know Sheila's going to be talking about, because Sheila Grant, by the way, truly is one of the great Canadian experts on this subject. I'm so delighted that she's here. But the point is that the world is changing as far as climate is concerned quite dramatically. And you can see from that one map, that one picture, that where there was traditionally sea ice, there is not as much anymore. And when we talk about sea ice, we're referring to, in the white area there, is referring to what is frozen all year round. And what is changing dramatically is that area is shrinking very quickly. To the point where it is, I think, a consensus among scientists that within a foreseeable future, not a never future, but a foreseeable future, the entire Arctic Ocean will be ice-free for several weeks and then potentially months at a time. None of us know whether the pattern of climate change will change dramatically over the next 100 years, but we can only assume that if the patterns that have begun take hold, that we're looking at a very different Arctic in terms of temperature, land, water, fish life, sea life, to the point now where, for example, they're discovering that there are whales that have never been in the Atlantic Ocean are now coming into the Atlantic Ocean, and they're coming through the passage, as are various other forms of fish life and plankton and animal life that are emerging. So we're seeing a dramatic change in the geography, a change in the climate, a change in the land, a change in the water. This is not new in the sense that it's been evolving over the last 50 years, but it's important to remember a couple of other facts about the climate change. The first one is that it is happening more quickly in the Arctic than anywhere else. It's happening most quickly in the polar north and in the polar south. And that in itself has enormous implications for life for all of us. When we look at the implications on sea levels, the implications for the temperature of the water, what impact that will have on the fishery, impact it will have on the Gulf Stream, impact it will have on weather and all the rest of it. But it's important for us to appreciate that the first people who are experiencing the full impacts of climate change are people who are living in the Arctic. And it's having a dramatic effect on their economy, it's having a dramatic effect on their way of life. And that will increase, and that will increasingly be the case. So the number of people who are going to be able to survive living traditionally off the land is going to be severely impacted by what we see, unless we can think of more creative ways of intervening. Obviously, it's having a major effect on animal life. You'll see all the speculation about how are polar bears going to survive and how are other animals going to be able to survive. But I think it's very important. I've said this, here in this room, I said it once before in talking about the Arctic. It's very important for us to get something right out of our heads at the outset, and that is that it's an empty land. It's not an empty land. There are people living there, and there are people who have lived there for thousands of years. The Inuit were later arrivals compared to other Indigenous people in Canada. We can trace many Indigenous groups in Canada back 15, even 20,000, some say now 25,000 years. But in the case of the Inuit, it's much more recent. But it's also important to remember that the people of the Arctic, the Inuit, are in effect one people who are living now in several countries that when they were there were not countries. We talk about sovereignty. It's important to understand that the concept of sovereignty is a very recent concept historically, and it relates in particular to the power of the nation state. And we can trace the rise of the nation state and the empires that in some cases extended nation states back several hundred years, but not necessarily when it comes to the far north, not necessarily several thousand years. So the people who've lived there for several thousand years, the Inuit people, have a very powerful sense, and this is going to continue to evolve in each one of the Arctic countries. that this land is their land. It's the only land they know, and it belongs to them in some important senses. This is a very sensitive topic. I'll come back to it in a minute when I talk a bit more about the future, but it's very, very important to understand that the whole of the Arctic extends well beyond any national borders. We like to think of the Arctic as ours, as Canadians, and we're offended if other countries are there or are somehow interfering with us, but we need to appreciate the fact that there are a great many peoples who have a claim to the Arctic in the broadest sense. Not the Arctic in terms of where it is in terms of Canada, but looking at that map, you can see all of the countries that are around the Arctic Pole that have a sense that this is their land too, and they have a claim and they have a stake in it. But it's even more important to remember that within that grouping of countries, there are northern peoples who have a different sense of their place in the discussion than perhaps even their own governments have. I'll come back to that point in a minute because it's politically going to be very interesting to see how the future unfolds. The third thing that's changing is the economy. And the economy is changing, and it's going to go through even more changes. As the climate changes, more places become accessible. And because of the incredible technological changes we've seen in terms of mapping and being able to assess where are some likely finds, where can we be likely to find minerals, where can we find oil, where can we find gas. There's been a bonanza in economic exploration, not only in Canada, but in Russia, in Norway, in Greenland, in Alaska, in every Arctic jurisdiction. There has been an extraordinary growth in economic activity and mineral discoveries, which are having in and of themselves a dramatic impact on the environment, and this impact will only grow and become more significant. We are putting a big burden on the land and on the water, and potentially, unless we decide that we're going to do things a little differently, it will have even more of an impact, because I don't have to tell you, non-geologists and non-scientists in the room, and I'm certainly one of those, when you look at the changing situation involving navigation and ability of ships and other vehicles to get to places they were never able to get to before, it becomes even more possible to explore for oil and gas and also to produce oil and gas. And that has enormous potential impact on the environment. It also has an enormous potential impact on the economies of the far north, and it's important to realize that there will continue to be a significant debate in each and every country about, well, how are the benefits from this development going to be shared? What do the people who live there get? Whether you're in Alaska, whether you're in Northwest Territories or Yukon or in Nunavut, in Labrador, these are major issues locally and with the federal government. And we are moving, I would suggest, to a shift in the order of things, in that it is now accepted as a given that the people who have lived there for a long time are going to be able to get at least some of the benefits from development. Whether it's as much as they should be getting, whether it's enough to bring them out of poverty, is a matter for real serious debate, but it nevertheless is very real. There's two other industries that you might not think about, but are really, really important in terms of looking at the development of the Arctic as we go forward. The first one is tourism. We've already had a number of tourist ships that have gone through the Northwest Passage, and that will only grow, and that will continue to have a major impact on communities that up until now have been really pretty isolated. And we often don't, I think, fully appreciate the extent of the impact and what we have to do about it. The footprint of people in the North is growing all the time. And if you'll pardon the sort of pun, is the footprint is more long-lasting than just, chasing across the snow as my namesake John Rae used to do in the middle of the 19th century. It's quite a different trip now than it was then. There are people in my family, by the way, who insist that we are somehow related, but I've been trying to figure that out. Finally, there is this world of transportation, and there's been a lot of talk about this. Ever since the Manhattan, you will recall that famous ship, American ship, naval ship that went through the Northwest Passage. It's important to really appreciate, and I hope others may agree with me, this is definitely coming. The potential for a route through the North, of course, has been a dream of Western explorers for about 600 years. And I was in Montreal the other day and was reminded that La Chine, it didn't even occur to me this was the case. La Chine Canal refers to the fact that Cartier thought he was getting to China. And that was the dream, of course, was that it would go through the St. Lawrence and then through the Great Lakes and ultimately would produce the passage. And then there were efforts by people to find passages in other places. Finally, in the middle of the 19th century, they found a route that one could take for a few weeks in the summer, but that stretch is now growing. It's no longer a couple of weeks, it's a much longer period of time. But we need to understand some things about the viability of major transportation routes going through the Northwest Passage. It's a ways off yet. And we need to understand that it's largely uncharted waters. It's not as if this is by any means, the ice is out, we put the boats on and away they go. There's all kinds of issues that we need to deal with and understand, and I'm going to come to those in just a moment. The final thing that I wanted to just refer to, because we are in the Military Institute and we are looking at security and defense issues in the far north, but I put them at the end of my comments because I really think it's important that we understand the security and defense issues in the way in which this context is changing. But it's also for Canadians need to, I think, fully appreciate that when we think about our neighbors, we really talk about the United States as being our neighbor and our neighbor to the south. But we need to understand that when you actually look at the world through the lens of the North Pole and the Arctic Circle, our neighbors are to the north and to the east and the west, and they're very close. Russia is not far away, and it's a huge border that we have with Russia, with the Arctic. Russia has the largest Arctic border of any country. Our relationship with Denmark and Greenland now an autonomous unit within Greenland, but that relationship is much, much closer, and frankly I think it should be even closer in terms of our knowledge and sharing and awareness of what the Inuit experience in Greenland has been. Quite different. If you go to Greenland, where I've been able to go very briefly, you get a completely difference of the architecture, how it's been treated and how it's been integrated into a certain culture than when you go into northern communities in Canada. We've got a lot to learn as Canadians about how these relationships need to be established. But our Alaskan neighbors are very significant, and our Norwegian neighbors are very significant. So these are different kinds of relationships. We've tried to establish something more real through the Arctic Council, But the Arctic Council itself, in terms of its governance, faces some real challenges in terms of our nation states actually prepared to give to the Council the capacity that actually it needs in order to be able to ensure the integrity of public spaces and the integrity of the public good when it comes to looking at development. And of course, if we fail to address these issues around sovereignty, around our ability to police our own borders. Right now, Canada likes to think we claim sovereignty, we insist on sovereignty. Stephen Harper said, you know, if we don't use it, we're going to lose it. And Mr. Trudeau said the same thing when he came into office in 2015. But I have to say that I think the execution of how we've been able to exercise sovereignty has been nowhere near to the rhetoric of how this is our new frontier. We really haven't integrated it into our policy thinking. It's starting to happen more. I think there's a greater appreciation now, certainly, of how challenging some of this is and how difficult it is, particularly when you consider that we are geographically huge, but our population is tiny, and therefore our military capacity and our defense capacity is not close to either the Russians or the Americans, obviously. We know that the Americans and the Russians have been there far more than they've necessarily even let us know that they're there. It's not far to go underneath the ice from ports in northern Russia across and doing all kinds of exploring and everything else. The last thing I want to just touch on is, you know, one of the real issues that we still have is the question of, well, whose land is where, whose borders are where, and what belongs to who. I joked a little bit before about is Santa a citizen of Russia or the United States or Canada? But these are much more serious issues, because if we can't determine what belongs to which countries and what in fact doesn't belong to anybody, we're not going to have clear rules to deal with issues around environmental protection, resource development, and obviously resource revenues, because the potential from development in a lot of these areas is the potential is huge, but so is the potential for harm, and so is the potential for mischief. We really haven't yet begun to resolve some of the critical questions of, well, where are the frontiers? Is it 200 miles or is it beyond the continental shelf? Where does our continental shelf end? Where does yours begin? We are, by the end of this debate, all of us as Canadians going to learn a lot more about the terrain underneath the ocean, underneath the surface of the water, than we ever thought we were going to find out. When you look at where the ridges are, where the places are, what's natural to the continental shelf of one country or another country, because this is all about the critical 100 or 150 miles that you can extend beyond, that you can't if you just say, well, it's just the economic zone 200 from the tip of land. Where is the tip of land underneath the ocean? That's the question. And I know that sometimes people's eyes glaze over when you look at this, but we have huge legal, and as a lawyer I love this, huge legal issues involved in what, who owns what, and who is responsible for what, and how are we going to deal with it. So my final word is this, is that as a country, our foreign policy is supposed to be based on rules, rule of law, acceptance of the role of the United Nations, and a recognition that multilateral decisions are better than unilateral decisions. What we need to appreciate as a country is that there are a number of superpowers, three in particular, the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese, who are not particularly enthusiastic about this approach to life. And we need to understand that. We're facing an uphill struggle here. And it's not resolved. And we used to think, well, at least the Americans are our allies. Well, in the Cold War, days, yes, of course, we could all understand how that alliance was built and what it was based on. But what we need to understand now is what I think we've seen in trade, we've seen in tweets, we've seen it in every other way possible. America is now acting out of a profound sense of its own self-interest and out of a strong sense of its own manifest destiny, the ideas which have been at the core of American thinking for a long, long time. And that means it's going to be very, very difficult for the Americans to accept that when they open up to economic development or resource development in one part of what they think is their ocean, it has a huge impact on everybody else, a huge impact on all of us. We have a significant disagreement with the United States about what is the Northwest Passage. The Army, I understand, the military no longer uses the term Northwest Passage. We use the term Canada's inland waters. It's hard to imagine a Stan Rogers song by that name. It doesn't quite have the same ring about it. But I think we all know what people are trying to say. They're trying to say, no, it's not just a passage from one place to another. It's actually within the island, the archipelago structure of the Arctic, and it belongs to us. But this is not accepted. There are no other countries that say, yeah, we agree. Chinese don't agree, the Russians don't agree, the Americans don't agree. So it will be interesting as time goes on to see how we actually are going to be able to say, yeah, we were not kidding when we said this is ours, this really is ours. And I think we know from looking at the disputes in the South China Sea and elsewhere, these can become highly tense and difficult areas of potential conflict. Whether they will be or not, I don't know. But I do know that it poses a dilemma for us. So the question and the challenge for Canada is how do we move forward together with a number of other countries to pursue this multilateral vision, and also to pursue a vision which includes in a much more positive way the political position of the Indigenous people themselves. We've been doing that domestically, slowly. It's been, from my point of view, it's been very, very slow, but it is nevertheless, I think, in motion, and it can't readily just be stopped at a certain point. Some other countries have moved ahead in a similar way, but others have not quite so much. So I think the future discussions within the Arctic Council are going to be very interesting. And the final point I would make is I look forward to the day when more Canadians are wrapped up and concerned and aware of the significance of these issues, because for a long time they have been very much the purview of a small but very dedicated group of people who have developed some profound expertise and tried to generate a level of understanding and awareness in Ottawa, obviously, but also among the general population, because ultimately the politicians will do where they think public opinion is going. And if public opinion is largely indifferent to what happens, then I think it's fair to say that our politicians will be largely indifferent to what happens, which I think would be too bad. So I wish you well. I'm sorry I can't stay for the conference, but I really do wish you well today. I look forward. I've been told by Dan that this will be broadcast to what you said, 2 or 3 million viewers. I think, Dan, is what I heard. I signed a thing giving a waiver. So there'll be an opportunity for all of us to look at ourselves on television and to watch it. But I want to thank you very, very much and wish you well in your deliberations. Thank you so much. It's early days. No, it's okay. Okay, here we go. Whitney.
Great, thanks for that opening address. I wonder if you could share some of your insights into different forms that Indigenous international engagement might look like, perhaps within some of those multilateral contexts that you were discussing, as we're sort of leaning forward into the future, where you see sort of a constellation of some of these different pressure
Well,
points?
it's very exciting. I mean, first of all, one of the great things that the UNDRIP discussion did at the UN over the last 25 years was it really provided a forum for Indigenous people to come together globally. So Indigenous diplomacy is a real thing. It's not just a sort of made-up thing. It's a real thing. And in the Arctic in particular, it's been really fascinating to watch, as I've seen it evolve, a much, much greater awareness of linkages between and among Inuit people, and a much greater enthusiasm for trying to understand how did this history evolve and how do we relate. I've seen it particularly as between the people of Greenland and the people of the high Arctic in Canada. I think there's quite a lot. Now, frankly, I think there's still too little. We still don't have a direct. I mean, it would be a lot cheaper, for example, if we were able to medevac people from Iqaluit to Greenland, where there's very good hospital care and a couple of population centers. It would make a whole lot more sense to do that than to fly people down to Montreal or down to Kingston or Toronto. And this is part of a whole other issue around why we don't have more and better care in the North itself. But in terms of cultural connection, in terms of discussion about, well, how did you connect with the Danish government? How did you get as much autonomy as you've had? What share of the revenues are you getting? How do they compare with us? These conversations are very active. They're very real. And in a way, they're held back a little bit because the economies of travel. Now, if you've got to fly to Denmark and then you fly from Denmark to Greenland, it's crazy, right? It's an hour flight, but they now say, well, you got to go all the way over there and you got to go all the way back. So there's still some things to do to reestablish some of these natural linkages. So I see an enormous potential. Same thing true with the Americans. We're learning a lot from the Inuit of Alaska in terms of some of the positives and negatives of how they've tended to do things. As you know, the revenue sharing in Alaska has tended to be, everybody gets a check, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it means that you're not saving up for the rainiest of days. And I think when we look at economic diversification, you've got to be saving some money and developing some capital out of the resource development that's in place. But there's a lot of good discussions. Of course, the difficulty with the Russians is that it's hard to get real autonomous, democratically functioning organizations in play. And if somebody were to say to me, have you seen any big difference since the collapse of the Berlin Wall? I'd say, no, I haven't seen as much as one would like to see.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I want to pick up on the point that you made about work between the Inuit of Greenland and of Nunavut, and would be really interested in your perspectives on the proposals that they have made for an Inuit-led and managed approach that would cross the international boundary between Denmark and Canada, which, I mean, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, it actually presents a policy or a legal challenge to kind of the organization of states. So it's taking it out, Inuit activism out of the framework of the international rules-based order, the organization of the nation state. And from their standpoint, that is actually the best way to sustain that particular part of the world. But it poses a huge challenge, it seems to me, to the way we are organized as governments, and would be interested in any comment you might have on that.
I'm a big believer that, this is going to be an evolutionary process. And I wouldn't be too worried about, if you follow this through to its logical conclusion, it means the end of the nation state. You sort of have to say, not really. Because first of all, we never follow anything through to its logical conclusion. I haven't, I don't think it's about separatism. I think it's about understanding the underlying identity of the Inuit people, which is a shared identity, and how difficult and how frustrating it has been for them not to have been able to find vehicles for political expression of their identity. So I think we should be encouraging steps in that direction. I also think that, as time goes forward, there may well be some evolution in terms of how, what role is given to a larger Inuit political formation. But I think we need to understand that a lot of what's going on is a powerful desire for recognition by non-Inuit actors and governments that the Inuit have been written out of a lot of their own history and the history of their land. I was reading Ken McGugan's very good, most recent account of Northern exploration, where he points out something which I think is so important, and that is that the most successful explorations were the ones that were guided by and influenced by the Inuit and the Dene, because they were listened to. And where they were completely ignored, for example, by Sir John Franklin, we know what disaster came about as a result of that. And so here I think it's going to be really important for Canada to demonstrate some degree of understanding that as far as the Inuit are concerned, their experience of Canada has been a colonial experience. And therefore, if we're serious about looking at, well, what does decolonization look like? This is one place where it needs to start. Now, I always, when I participate in a lot of discussions with Indigenous groups about this question of decolonization, I say to them, but the thing we need to understand a little bit better is that when we compare imperial powers going to Africa or going to Asia and then waking up 200 years later and saying, why are we there anyway, let's get out, they leave. It's a little more difficult now for us to say that's what's going to happen, because our histories have become intertwined. We're all here to stay in some profound sense. So we can't rewrite history to sort of say, well, let's write ourselves out of this history. You can't do that. You write everybody has to get written in. And that's a different process. But I do think we need to appreciate the extent to which, particularly among the younger Inuit thinkers and actors in the political sphere, is that they look at the experience of the last 60, 70, 80 years as Canadian colonialism coming in, saying, we're moving you from here to there. We're putting you in a residential school. We're doing this, we're doing that. It's not been a good experience. It's been a very tough experience. And I think Mr. Trudeau has a sense of this at a very emotional level. I think he understands that there's ground that has to be made up. And I think the government federally is trying to do that now. But the important point is to make the apology, but then it's to say, and this is what we're going to do as a result. If you just say, I'm sorry, I think we've all in our personal lives, we've been through situations where we've apologized, and the person to whom we're apologizing isn't very impressed because you haven't changed your behavior. So we have to figure out how to change our behavior. And I think that's hard for governments to do. It's hard for bureaucracies and organizations that have a very kind of traditional view of how things should be done. It's hard to make that change happen. But I do think it's going to be part of the ongoing conversation. And it's not just happening in Canada. This is a discussion that we really can't just say, sorry, you can't talk about this. If we tried to do that, it would not work. And so we have to kind of go with it and see where and how it takes us. I don't think it's going to lead to a breakup of Canada. I think it's going to lead to a broader reimagining of what our country can be and how we can connect with other countries. That was a long answer to a short question, so.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, please, Frank, yeah.
Okay, one more, that's the last.
Talking about experts, yeah.
Well, not really. I'm past it, perhaps. But anyway, thank you so much for those words. Just about following through on the things you've just been talking about, thinking about action. Why aren't we doing more, I would ask, about devolution? That is, take the lead from the North, give them more capacity, not only to talk to us Southerners who don't really know very much about the area and what needs doing, but to lead internationally as well. And this comes to international Aboriginal thinking. But my thought is basically about devolution. To Nunavut, to the Northwest Territories, find ways to give them more power. There are difficulties in there, which I'm sure you're aware of. It'd be interesting to hear what your thought is for devolution as a main means of decolonization, if that's...
Well, I am one of those people who believes that the underlying problem is money. Our governments are not prepared to invest enough money to create real capacity and real governance ability in the North. We don't have a university in Nunavut. We don't have a major hospital in Nunavut. We have the whole way of life is based on, at some point you've got to go south. If you want to go to university, you've got to go this, you've got to do that. And so, you know, that creates its own identity issues and then people coming back and so forth. So I hate to be crass about it, but to me, what's missing in all of the discussion about self-government is a full and deep appreciation of just how much this is going to cost. And if you say, well, it's going to cost a lot of money, you say, yeah, but we've taken a lot of money out of this part of Canada. And if we give people a greater share of the revenues from resource development, and we give people, we're more generous about saying this is what it's going to take, and we're not going to get a full take for the federal fisc at the beginning. The federal model is still, we'll take most of the money and we'll give some of it back to you if you ask for it nicely and are prepared to devise your program so that we can basically control how those programs operate. And that manner of thinking has to change. That's the thinking that needs to change. And I think that's what's proving very, very difficult. And I always say to people, when we're talking about Indigenous issues, I say you've got to follow the money and you've got to follow the lawyers. So you've got to find out what's really happening with the money, and you've got to find out what are the actual arguments that the federal government is using in court when disputes go to court. And you'll find that those arguments have not actually changed that much. Although, to be fair, I think that just before she left office, Jody Wilson-Raybould put out some directives to her lawyers to say, you know, that's the game's up, guys. We're going to have to start being consistent with what we say, and it'll be important to see whether those directions are now followed through by her successors. Thank you very much, everybody.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.